The airlock hissed open, and Kellen stepped onto the station's main deck, his boots clicking against polished metal that reflected the cold gleam of distant stars. The station was enormous, a labyrinthine structure floating in the void, buzzing quietly with machinery that seemed almost alive, like a massive, breathing organism. He pulled his jacket tighter against the recycled air, which smelled faintly of ozone and engine grease, and tried not to let his nerves show. First days were always awkward, and here, in the heart of alien bureaucracy, awkwardness had an entirely new scale. Crew members passed by, each wrapped in their own routines. There were beings with skin that shifted colors depending on their mood, or so the station rumors claimed, and some that moved with angles and bends no human skeleton could manage. And then there was her. She sat alone at a small, metallic table near the observation deck, a tray of food in front of her untouched. Her ears were long and graceful, curving backward like twin crescents, giving her an elegant, slightly predatory look. Her hair, if it could be called that by human standards, shimmered faintly with bioluminescent streaks that pulsed gently with the station's energy grid. Everyone avoided her, whispered about her instability and the so-called failed experiment that had left her marked, and yet she seemed entirely absorbed in the rhythm of her solitary meals. Kellen watched as she delicately lifted a synthetic protein cube with chopsticks that appeared to be custom-made for her long fingers. She didn't glance up when someone nearly stumbled into the table, didn't react when a maintenance drone whirred too close, yet there was a precision in her movements that suggested discipline, if not a hint of ritual. "Everyone keeps their distance," muttered a humanoid crew member who passed him, a nervous twitch in one three-jointed finger. "That one, she's dangerous." Kellen raised an eyebrow. "Dangerous how? Does she bite or does she make bad coffee?" The humanoid blinked unamused. "More mental, unstable, do not sit near her." "Ah," Kellen said, as though considering it thoughtfully. "Then I'll definitely sit there. Someone needs to teach her proper coffee etiquette." He strode across the deck with the kind of confidence that comes from having nothing to lose and everything to learn, sliding into the empty seat without a word. She paused mid-bite, one ear flicking ever so slightly, a movement so subtle it could have been ignored, yet it felt like the station itself had shivered. Kellen picked up his tray, placed it beside hers, and began eating, deliberately slow, humming an off-key tune that might have been a human song or an accidental note generated by the station's ambient frequencies. She didn't speak. He didn't either. And yet, an invisible thread seemed to tie them together, stretching across the emptiness of the dining area like a delicate filament of light. Later, in the engineering bays, Kellen discovered the true nature of his new workplace. The station's systems were vast and labyrinthine, with maintenance conduits snaking through walls like metallic vines, lights flickering occasionally as if the station itself had a sense of humor. A failed coolant pump splattered liquid across the floor. Kellen slipped and spun, arms windmilling in a human attempt to avoid gravity's final verdict. Lyra, he learned that was her name when she finally responded, reached out with a hand that had fingers longer than his forearm, catching him effortlessly. "You humans really struggle with simple physics," she said, voice flat, yet tinged with amusement, the faintest quiver at the edges of her long ears betraying her own pleasure in teasing him. "I prefer to think of it as interpretive gravity dance," Kellen quipped, regaining his balance. "You'd be amazed at how elegant my falls can be." She allowed herself a tiny smirk. The first laugh he heard from her was quiet, but it echoed in the bay like music bouncing off steel walls. The crew, who had been watching from the shadows, looked momentarily uncertain. Was she smiling at him, at a human? Their days fell into a rhythm. Kellen would observe the machinery, his human intuition filling gaps that Lyra's engineered precision couldn't quite predict, while she would notice things he would overlook. The subtle hum of a conduit about to fail, the way a metal panel's vibration hinted at a loose screw. In one corridor, a cleaning drone slipped and sprayed lubricant across a maintenance hatch. Kellen pretended to slip theatrically, arms flailing like a space-bound marionette, and she flicked an ear, shooting a glance that was both exasperated and amused. "I swear if you survive your first month without breaking something vital, I'll consider it a miracle," she said. "And if I do?" he asked, tilting his head, grin widening. "Then you'll have the dubious honor of being my next cautionary tale," she replied, deadpan, yet her lips twitched. By the end of the week, Kellen noticed the change in the crew. The whispers had softened, curiosity replacing fear. A few even lingered near their workstations, pretending to calibrate instruments but really watching, hoping to catch a glimpse of what it was like when a human and an alien woman with long, elegant ears worked in tandem. At night, Kellen would find himself staring out the observation deck. The stars stretched thin like silver threads across an endless black canvas. Beside him, Lyra sometimes joined him, not speaking, ears twitching in subtle patterns that seemed to communicate more than words ever could. The station was vast, cold, and indifferent, yet here, in this improbable alliance, a spark of warmth had begun. And somewhere deep in the station's systems, beneath the hum of engines and the pulse of lights, a secret waited, quietly aware that two curious minds had begun to notice it, and that perhaps together they could unlock something that had been forgotten for too long. The next morning the station felt different, though nothing had changed. The same hum of engines, the same flickering lights, the same endless corridors stretched in every direction, but the air seemed lighter. Kellen moved through the maintenance decks with his toolkit bouncing against his hip, half expecting a crew member to corner him with whispered warnings about sitting next to Lyra. None appeared. Instead, the crew gave him sideways glances that carried faint curiosity, the human equivalent of a slow blink. Lyra's presence had shifted something invisible, something subtle yet palpable. They met in the hydroponics bay, a strange pocket of life aboard the metallic city. Plants of impossible shapes and colors grew under synthetic sunlight, their roots twisting through nutrient-rich gel. Lyra crouched beside a fragile stalk of phosphorescent greenery, her long ears swaying as if attuned to the faint hum of the life support conduits. "You're supposed to check the irrigation loops first," she said, tone more observation than critique. "But humans are predictable in their mistakes." "Predictable, yes," Kellen said, kneeling beside her, "but always entertaining." He deliberately poked at a moss-covered sensor with a screwdriver, pretending it might explode in a spray of glowing sap. Lyra's ear twitched, the corner of her mouth lifting in something close to a grin. "Do not," she warned, voice low, "remind the plants of the last human who tried that. They still whisper about him." Kellen paused, pretending to clutch his chest. "Whisper about me? I'm flattered." He jabbed at another sensor, and the moss shivered like it had just laughed. They worked in silence, the kind of quiet that carried its own humor. The soft squelch of biogel underfoot, the rhythmic whir of nutrient pumps, the occasional squeak of a hovering drone correcting its trajectory mid-flight. Kellen found that with Lyra, silence wasn't awkward. It was a shared language, punctuated by tiny jokes or small, absurd observations. "You know," he said, balancing a tray of seedlings in one hand, "if we survive this week without accidentally flooding a corridor, I think we should commemorate it with something dramatic, like a slow-motion dance in the gravity lift." Lyra's ears twitched, "and draw the attention of the entire crew. No, thank you. Some reputations are worth protecting." "Fine," he said, "we'll settle for subtle chaos." Hours passed with the rhythm of their work, a drill whirring, a conduit hum, a panel sliding open with a hiss. Kellen discovered that Lyra's senses were far beyond human norms. She could detect minute fluctuations in pressure along the irrigation loops, subtle variances in the electromagnetic field that hinted at upcoming malfunctions. Watching her work was like observing a maestro conduct an orchestra that only she could hear. During a brief lunch break, Kellen brought a tray of replicated protein cubes to the observation deck. Lyra joined him, sliding the tray over with a precision that made him wonder if she could calculate the exact trajectory of every cube in the universe. He popped one into his mouth. "Not bad," he said. "Could use a pinch of salt or maybe a comet's tail." Her lips twitched. "If you season it with cosmic debris, do not blame me when your digestive system files a formal complaint." He laughed, a human sound oddly bright against the station's metallic corridors. A small group of crew members lingered nearby, pretending to calibrate instruments but really watching. A few snickered quietly at Kellen's antics, the exaggerated gestures, the way. By the third day, Kellen and Lyra had established a rhythm that the rest of the crew could no longer ignore. Their partnership was no longer a curiosity but a quietly disruptive force, like a pebble thrown into the station's vast machinery, sending subtle vibrations through the entire system. They moved together through the labyrinth of corridors, past humming energy conduits and blinking status panels, sometimes joking, sometimes silent, always attentive to the station's soft complaints. Kellen had discovered that humor was a surprisingly effective tool for survival here. He tripped over a coiled cable in Sector 12, arms flailing in what he called his interpretive zero-gravity dance, only to be caught by Lyra without a hint of struggle. "You're human, aren't you?" she asked dryly, the edge of her mouth twitching, ears flicking in rhythm with his frantic flailing. "I like to think of it as artistic expression," he replied, bowing awkwardly in midair. Lyra shook her head, almost imperceptibly, yet the faintest ghost of a smile appeared on her lips. She was the master of subtlety, reading vibrations, shifts in electromagnetic currents, even the smallest flicks of Kellen's eyes, and responding with precision that made him feel both admired and mildly terrified. Their tasks that day took them deep into the station's maintenance sectors, a sprawling network of pipes, conduits, and service tunnels that smelled faintly of ozone and heated metal. Kellen carried a panel of diagnostic instruments, each blinking light and whirring sensor feeding data into his portable reader. Lyra moved ahead of him, her long ears twitching like antennae, picking up the faintest vibrations in the structure, sensing microfractures in conduits before any human sensor could detect them. "I swear," Kellen muttered, adjusting his gloves, "your ears must be some kind of cosmic radar. Do they come with a manual?" "They come with patience, observation, and an unfortunate tendency to pick up the conversations of all nearby humans," she replied. "Including you." He grinned. "Good to know, so far I like what I hear." As they worked, small bursts of humor punctuated their labor. A drone carrying coolant failed to align with a junction, spinning like an excitable top. Kellen leaned back dramatically, arms flailing, narrowly avoiding a collision, while Lyra flicked her ears, muttering something that sounded suspiciously like a reprimand. The drone, seemingly aware of its own clumsiness, corrected its trajectory, and Kellen feigned a bow to it. "Your timing is impeccable, Madam Drone. Bravo." Lyra's lips twitched again. "Do not anthropomorphize machinery," she said, though there was a softness in her voice. The station itself seemed to respond to their presence. Lights pulsed a little brighter, displays flickered in sync with their movements, and occasionally the low hum of the engines felt almost conversational, as if the metal and circuits approved of their partnership. Kellen made a mental note to record the phenomenon. His reports would surely be dismissed as fiction, but the patterns were there, undeniable. At one junction, they discovered a minor but unusual anomaly. A conduit feeding secondary life support had been rerouted improperly decades ago, creating subtle fluctuations in pressure and temperature. Most engineers would have noted it but dismissed it as insignificant. Lyra's enhanced senses, combined with Kellen's intuitive problem-solving, allowed them to detect the cascading effects before they could escalate. "You humans have a way of noticing the obvious after it becomes a problem," Lyra said, adjusting a valve with delicate precision. "I suppose that makes you charmingly predictable." "I'll take it as a compliment," Kellen said, wiping his brow. Though if I'm predictable, at least I'm reliably entertaining. Their humor was a shield against the monotony and subtle dangers of the station. A leaking coolant line, a faulty sensor, or a misaligned panel became opportunities for banter rather than panic. Kellen had perfected the art of making the mundane absurd, while Lyra's dry wit, delivered with a twitch of an ear or a flick of her fingers, counterbalanced his antics. By evening, they retreated to the observation deck, overlooking the void of space. Stars stretched like silver threads across black velvet, distant nebulae casting ghostly glows through reinforced glass. Lyra leaned against the railing, arms crossed, her ears catching faint pulses of the station's electromagnetic currents. Kellen sat beside her, notebook open, sketching improbable diagrams of airflow, nutrient loops, and whimsical inventions that would never survive reality. "You humans draw chaos beautifully," she said quietly, ears flicking in the dim light. "And you aliens measure elegance perfectly," he replied. "I'm learning something every day, mostly about balance and gravity's cruel sense of humor." They fell into a comfortable silence, the kind that spoke more than words could. Somewhere deep within the station, a pulse of anomalous energy flickered faintly, hidden beneath layers of redundant systems and safety protocols. It was subtle, almost imperceptible to anyone else, but Kellen felt it, a ripple in the patterns he had begun to notice. Lyra's ears twitched as well, a mirrored recognition, though neither spoke of it. By nightfall, the station's corridors were quiet. Only the hum of engines, the soft click of maintenance drones, and the occasional hiss of venting gas filled the air. Kellen and Lyra's partnership had begun to shift the station's dynamics subtly. The crew, once wary and divided, now lingered in doorways, curious, hesitant, drawn by the silent but growing rhythm between human and alien. And in that quiet partnership, a foundation was being laid. Not just for repairs, maintenance, or survival, but for trust, an unpredictable, fragile, and yet remarkably potent force. In the metallic heart of the station, humor and precision, human curiosity and alien perception, began to intertwine, creating a rhythm that would soon carry them toward discoveries far larger than coolant lines, blinking sensors, or even the hum of the engines themselves. Somewhere in the endless corridors, the station whispered secrets only they might hear. And together, Kellen and Lyra were beginning to listen. The station's corridors had taken on a rhythm of their own, a soft, mechanical heartbeat that seemed to pulse in sync with the footsteps of those who dared to navigate its labyrinth. Kellen and Lyra moved through these halls like dancers in zero gravity, a subtle choreography of observation and improvisation. Today, however, the hum of engines carried a slightly sharper edge, a fluctuation that made even seasoned crew members glance nervously at their displays. "See that?" Kellen asked, pointing to a thin, irregular line pulsing along the auxiliary conduit. "The station's twitching." Lyra's ears swiveled sharply, catching the electromagnetic whisper of the anomaly. "More like it's trying to get our attention, a subtle warning if you can call it that." "I've read the manuals," Kellen said, peering at the conduit. "They don't mention anything about stations giving hints or subtle hints that might wink at you." Lyra flicked one ear. Then clearly the manuals were written by someone with no sense of humor. Their task led them to the lower decks, a maze of metal girders, service panels, and pipes that snaked like silver veins. Here, the station felt alive in ways that made Kellen's skin prickle. Lights flickered in patterns that almost seemed deliberate, and tiny microsparks danced along exposed conduits. Lyra moved ahead, ears picking up vibrations and currents invisible to any human instrument. Kellen followed, adjusting sensors, carefully documenting every anomaly with exaggerated theatrics, waving his hands as though to ward off imaginary gremlins in the wiring. "You're ridiculous," Lyra said dryly, as he leaned over a console pretending to faint at a minor spark. "Do you practice this on Earth?" "Only during company meetings," he replied, arms spread dramatically. "You should try it. It's excellent for morale." She didn't respond, only flicked her ears once, an almost imperceptible twitch that might have been amusement or warning. They arrived at a junction panel humming with unusual energy. The conduits feeding life support and environmental controls were subtly out of sync, small fluctuations that could cascade into larger failures if ignored. This would explain the odd temperature shifts in the crew quarters, Kellen muttered, running diagnostics. I thought I was imagining it. Imagining it would have been preferable, Lyra said, sliding a panel open with delicate precision. At least then you wouldn't have to smell the coolant vapor while I fix it. He waved dramatically, inhaling the faint metallic scent. Ah yes, the bouquet of engineered survival, nothing like it. As they worked, their banter continued. Kellen attempted to calibrate the flow of coolant through the conduits while juggling a floating toolkit, and Lyra, ever precise, corrected him with minimal motion. You know, he said, balancing a wrench in midair, you could at least pretend to be impressed. I am, she replied, her voice calm, ears twitching like twin antennae, in a very controlled, slightly judgmental way. The anomaly, however, was more complex than they had anticipated. Deep within the station's structural matrices, they discovered a sealed conduit carrying raw data lines, encrypted and looping through redundant nodes. Someone or something had intentionally hidden it decades ago. Lyra traced by mid-cycle, the station had begun to hum with a quiet energy, the kind that seemed to anticipate problems before they arrived. Kellen and Lyra moved through the corridors like seasoned improvisers, balancing protocol and instinct. Every panel, conduit, and console seemed to respond to their attention, and even the maintenance drones appeared to acknowledge their presence with a soft hum, like obedient pets. Today, the tasks demanded not only precision, but collaboration on a scale that tested their wits and patience. A section of the primary life support grid had developed subtle oscillations, and if left unchecked, the fluctuations could cascade into half the station going into emergency lockdown. Kellen approached the panel, toolkit floating in a zero-gravity harness. I think we have a code red or a code mildly annoying, he muttered, glancing at Lyra. Lyra raised an eyebrow, one ear twitching. Humor will not stabilize the grid, she said, though the faintest twitch at the corner of her lips suggested she appreciated the attempt. Ah, but it makes failure more entertaining, Kellen replied, flipping a switch with exaggerated caution. Sparks hissed along the conduit, and he flailed slightly, only to be caught with a graceful sweep of Lyra's hand. You should consider taking dramatic classes, she said, her tone perfectly flat, or at least learn to land without causing collateral damage. I prefer to call it style, he said, grinning. Graceful chaos with a hint of human ingenuity. The anomaly, however, was more complex than either had anticipated. Deep in the station's power matrix, redundant nodes had been rerouted decades ago, leaving tiny pockets of instability that could go unnoticed for months. Lyra's long ears picked up the microcurrents, subtle vibrations in the metal, shifts in electromagnetic patterns invisible to human instruments. Kellen, meanwhile, applied his human intuition, recognizing patterns the station itself seemed to overlook. As they worked, humor continued to lubricate the tension. A coolant drone misaligned and sprayed a fine mist over Kellen's gloves. Ah, yes, he said, flicking the mist off dramatically. The spa treatment I didn't know I ordered. Lyra's ears twitched sharply. I do not provide spa services, she replied, though your dramatics are tolerable. Hours passed with a rhythm that balanced observation and improvisation. Kellen calibrated the conduits while Lyra monitored subtle feedback signals, her fingers gliding over consoles with an elegance that made him feel clumsy by comparison. At one point, Kellen reached for a wrench that floated past him in zero gravity. Catch, he said, tossing it toward Lyra. She snatched it effortlessly, ears flicking. Do you often endanger your tools for entertainment? Only on Thursdays, Kellen said, and today happens to be Thursday. Finally, they traced the instability to a sealed hub buried behind a series of access panels. The hub carried a hidden repository of encrypted instructions and contingency protocols, stored decades ago and forgotten. Lyra traced the energy flows, her ears twitching as she decoded the subtle shifts. "This isn't just a reroute," she said, her voice low. "Someone deliberately encoded a sequence here. It could prevent a cascade failure, but only if we trust it and each other, enough to execute the protocols." Kellen studied the readouts, a slow smile forming. "Trust, huh? Sounds dangerously complicated. I'll need coffee, a snack, and maybe a pep talk from a holographic kitten." Lyra's lips twitched, the first genuine smile in days. "Fine. Let's proceed without unnecessary theatrics," she said, though her tone betrayed amusement. Together, they worked through the encryption, calibrating, rerouting, and stabilizing the hidden sequences. Each adjustment carried a silent tension, punctuated by Kellen's occasional quip about the station's apparent fondness for dramatic irony. Lyra's responses were measured, ears flicking, fingers precise, a combination of grace and focus that balanced Kellen's improvisation perfectly. By evening, the system hummed in a steady rhythm, the fluctuations minimized, life support stable, and the station's metal corridors resonating with a quiet, approving pulse. Kellen and Lyra floated toward the observation deck. The stars stretched thin like silver threads across the void, nebulae casting faint glows through reinforced glass. "Half the station survives another day," Kellen said, bowing to the distant stars. "We should celebrate with something dramatic, perhaps synchronized zero-gravity cartwheels." Lyra's ears twitched sharply. "I said no theatrics," she said, though the corner of her lips betrayed her amusement. "I'll settle for subtle chaos then," he replied, floating beside her, notebook in hand, scribbling diagrams that combined technical observations with exaggerated doodles of improbable accidents. The crew began to notice their silent revolution. The once feared Lyra now moved confidently through the corridors, while Kellen's unpredictable humor humanized her in ways that slowly dissolved fear and prejudice. Small jokes, subtle gestures, and shared competence had begun to ripple through the station. And beneath the reinforced flooring, within the hum of circuits and conduits, the hidden archive pulsed softly, waiting for the next stage of discovery. The human and the alien woman with long ears had not only stabilized systems, they had begun to transform the culture of the station itself, laying the groundwork for trust, ingenuity, and perhaps a future where the improbable could become possible. By the time the station settled into night mode, with lights dimmed and engines humming steadily, Kellen and Lyra lingered on the observation deck. Stars glimmered like scattered diamonds, and the silence was rich with potential. The anomaly, the hidden sequences, and the quiet revolution of trust and humor remained ready for the next step, if they could continue to navigate the delicate balance of danger, wit, and interspecies cooperation. The hum of the station carried a different tone that morning, a faint but insistent vibration that threaded through the metallic corridors like a quiet warning. Kellen adjusted his toolkit harness, eyes scanning the blinking panels lining the hallway, while Lyra moved ahead, ears twitching with the station's subtle rhythms. Today would not be routine. The hidden hub they had discovered days earlier pulsed faintly in sync with the station's energy grid, as if impatient to reveal its secrets. "You know," Kellen said, balancing a floating wrench in zero gravity, "I've been thinking. Maybe this hub just wants some attention. We could sing it a song, or dance." Lyra didn't look back. "Or we could not anthropomorphize critical infrastructure," she said, though the corner of her lips twitched ever so slightly, a silent acknowledgement that his antics amused her. They entered the hub via a narrow maintenance corridor, the walls lined with redundant conduits and blinking diagnostic panels. The air smelled faintly of ionized metal and warm coolant. Kellen floated beside Lyra, carefully documenting anomalies and joking about the station's mysterious sense of humor, while she worked with focused precision, adjusting the flux nodes with fingers longer than his forearm, each movement calculated, minimal, and perfect. The sealed repository of data lay behind a panel that hummed with soft energy pulses. Lyra's long ears flicked, tracing the subtle electromagnetic currents that crisscrossed the module. "The encryption is not just digital," she murmured. "It's layered with physiological feedback. Whoever encoded this wanted someone with heightened perception to access it." Kellen peered over her shoulder. "So basically, a cosmic puzzle for aliens with fancy ears and humans who tell bad jokes." "You're not entirely wrong," Lyra replied, her voice low, eyes scanning streams of scrolling code. The module's interface pulsed, responding only to the exact combination of neural input and manual calibration. Kellen mimicked her motions, adjusting tools while she modulated subtle energy feedback, their movements synchronized despite their different species and approaches. Sparks flared briefly from a misaligned flux node, and Kellen ducked dramatically, arms flailing. Lyra's ears twitched sharply. "You're lucky I've developed a tolerance for human absurdity," she said, brushing the sparks off the panel with delicate precision. Minutes stretched into hours. Their banter softened the tension, small jokes punctuating the intricate work. Kellen quipped about the module blinking like a nervous star, while Lyra flicked her ears in mock reproach. The interplay of humor and focus became a rhythm in itself, a delicate dance that allowed them to tackle a task the rest of the crew could barely comprehend. Finally, the module unlocked, revealing a trove of terraforming data and emergency life support protocols. The calculations were detailed and precise, capable of preventing cascading failures across multiple station sectors. Lyra's eyes narrowed, ears twitching as she confirmed the integrity of the sequences. If this data is implemented correctly, it could stabilize every... By the time the 7th cycle of rotation began, the station had transformed, not in structure, but in spirit. The corridors hummed with a sense of quiet anticipation, and the crew moved with a new awareness, glances occasionally flicking toward Kellen and Lyra, whose partnership had quietly redefined the rules of interaction. Where once fear and superstition dominated, curiosity and cautious trust now ruled. Even the rumors about Lyra, the alien woman with long ears, had softened. Whispers of danger had been replaced with cautious admiration. Kellen floated through the main engineering deck, toolkit slung casually at his side, humming an off-key tune that had become his signature. Lyra followed, adjusting conduits with precise flicks of her fingers. They moved in tandem now, a rhythm honed over days of shared challenges and quiet humor, a partnership that was more than human and alien. It was two intelligences finding balance in a complex, indifferent system. Earlier in the cycle, they had fully integrated the hidden hub's repository into the station's core. The life support systems, long prone to subtle instabilities, now pulsed with perfect cadence. Energy grids balanced themselves almost instinctively, and the station's redundant nodes seemed to anticipate minor anomalies before they became critical. Kellen had joked about teaching the station to perform engineering jazz, and Lyra had countered with dry, precise commentary, but beneath their banter lay genuine accomplishment. Now they were facing one final challenge. The station's central diagnostic matrix had detected residual anomalies in Sector 23, a place few dared to enter. Kellen glanced at Lyra. Last adventure before a well-earned cup of synth cocoa. Lyra's ears twitched. "I would prefer the cocoa first," she said, though the faint twitch of her lips betrayed amusement. "But the anomalies will not resolve themselves." The sector was a tangle of old maintenance conduits, redundant panels, and patches of reinforced plating that bore the scars of decades. As they navigated, a series of tiny microbursts pulsed through the corridors, leftover traces of energy surges from the hidden hub. Kellen, ever dramatic, spun once to avoid a minor spark, only to land perfectly on a maintenance strut. Lyra's eyes flicked at him, ears twitching, a subtle acknowledgement of his flair for chaos. "Have you considered," she asked dryly, that zero-gravity pirouettes are not standard procedure. I prefer to call it style, Kellen said, grinning. The anomalies were subtle, fluctuating energy signatures that hinted at microfractures in the station's central grid. Working together, Kellen predicted patterns based on intuitive reasoning, while Lyra traced the electromagnetic currents with uncanny precision. Their synchronized efforts allowed them to stabilize the sector before any cascading failures could occur. During the final adjustments, Kellen paused. "You know, for someone supposedly unstable, you handle pressure well." Lyra's ears twitched sharply. "And you human have learned that chaos is not always bad. It can complement precision." For the first time, Kellen realized how much he had changed. On Earth, he thrived on improvisation, but here, in the cold metallic heart of space, he had learned patience, observation, and the quiet power of listening, both to the station and to a partner who was utterly unlike him. Lyra, too, had grown. The human beside her, unpredictable and humorous, had taught her that trust could be forged not through isolation or fear, but through shared effort and laughter. By the time they returned to the observation deck, the stars stretched endlessly beyond the glass, thin threads of silver against the void. The station's hum was steady, calm, almost content, as if it recognized that its systems were no longer at odds but in harmony. Crew members passed silently, some lingering just long enough to offer nods or quiet smiles, a subtle acknowledgement that change had taken root. Kellen and Lyra stood side by side, trays of replicated food before them, eating in the quiet comfort of mutual understanding. No one avoided her. No one whispered. The once feared alien woman was no longer isolated, and the human engineer was no longer the outsider stumbling blindly through the machinery. Together they had bridged divides, solved decades-old mysteries, and restored stability to a station that was more than metal and circuits. It was a community, fragile and alive. "You know," Kellen said, leaning back and tracing constellations on the glass with a gloved finger, "we've probably saved lives